The story of the Hudson's Bay Company is one of the most complicated and central stories in Canadian and Indigenous history, the expansion of the British Empire, the whole concept of colonialism, the history of capitalism and corporations. I mean, the company literally went from fur traders and canoes to Main Street department stores to Zellers and back again, and we are going to do a series of videos on the history of the HBC, its rival, the Northwest Company, and how the fur trade became suburban strip malls sometime in the future. But for today, I really want to talk about the rent the HBC was required to pay, and that one time they gave Queen Elizabeth some actual living beavers. The royal charter that established the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670 granted the Company of Adventurers trading into Hudson Bay a near total monopoly over all resource development and commercial exploitation opportunities in the entire Hudson Bay drainage basin, which is all of the land where water drains out into the Hudson or the James Bay. This land makes up most of northern Ontario and Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, the Northwest Territories, and even stretched down into Montana and the Dakotas. This gigantic land was called Rupert's Land by colonial powers because, according to the king, it technically belonged to Prince Rupert, who was the king's nephew, despite the fact that Rupert would never visit, and that thousands of Indigenous peoples already called this land home. Nevertheless, the HBC had a total monopoly to do whatever business they saw fit in the area, and that business was furs. Beaver furs, to be exact. While the beaver was the most profitable of the furs, given Europe's obsession with hats made of the North American rodent, and the Hudson Bay Company was the place to get your fanciest hats of the time. They set up a headquarters at York Factory in northern Manitoba, and for nearly 300 years, the Hudson's Bay Company was the way of life for most of what is now Western Canada. So what then did the British Crown require for payment for all of this land? Well, the rent expected was 2 elk and 2 black beaver, and it was only to be paid whenever the king was in town. This is true. For the entire control of most of northwestern North America, the charter of the HBC demanded that the company yield and pay yearly to us and our heirs and successors for the same 2 elks and 2 black beavers, whensoever and as often as we, our heirs and successors, shall happen to enter the said countries, territories, and regions hereby granted. Literally, the HBC's only charter obligation to pay rent for half of what is now Canada was 2 elks and 2 beavers whenever the sovereign came to town. And this rent ceremony is such an incredibly rare event because of the relative rarity of visits to Western Canada by members of the British royalty. Since the company was founded in the year 1670, they've only paid rent 4 times. The first time the ceremony was ever performed was in 1927, when Edward, then Prince of Wales, traveled to Alberta where he had already purchased a large cattle ranch and had fallen in love with Western lifestyle. His route took him through Winnipeg, which was the Canadian headquarters of the Hudson Bay Company, and this provided an excellent opportunity for the very first ever rent ceremony to be performed by the HBC, as a bit of a symbol of Canadian loyalty to the British Crown. At the CPR station in Winnipeg on August 9th of that year, Prince Edward accepted the 2 black beaver pelts and 2 mounted elk heads on behalf of his father, King George V, before continuing on to his property in the Alberta foothills. 12 years goes by the time the second rent ceremony happens, and a lot goes on in the meantime. George V dies, so Edward becomes King Edward, but then he abdicates the throne to marry a woman he loves, and so the crown falls to his brother, who's now known as King George VI, who's the father of the current Queen Elizabeth. And so it was in 1939 that George VI was on his first tour of Canada with his wife, traveling coast to coast by train from May to June. The rent ceremony took place at the historic Upper Fort Garry Gate in downtown Winnipeg on May 24th. There were a number of important dignitaries present, like the Prime Minister Mackenzie King and the Hudson Bay's Governor Patrick Cooper, who presented the king with the beaver pelts and the mounted elk. This ceremony was filmed and broadcast live by radio across the British Empire, and it was particularly interesting because Cooper's ancestor was actually one of the original investors in the company. He put money into the HBC 2 years before they received the charter. The last 2 rent ceremonies were both paid to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. The third one happened in 1959 at Assiniboine Park in Winnipeg, and it was the very first time that the rent was paid to Her Majesty. The governor at the time, while presenting the elk and the beaver, mentioned that the ceremony was done in almost the exact same way as when her father had visited some 20 years earlier. The last time the ceremony was done, things were quite different. The pomp and ceremony was much bigger. It was July 1970, and the company was celebrating its 300th anniversary. Queen Elizabeth was once again visiting Canada, and she was in Winnipeg when her train took her north towards Selkirk and Lower Fort Garry. P.S. That's the same place from one of our ghost videos, which you can check out here. The rent ceremony fell on a particularly rainy day, but it was all the more special because this time the rent was still alive. Instead of the 2 beaver pelts, the Queen received a tank containing 2 live beavers and a large quantity of poplar sticks. Her Majesty's royal rodents spent the ceremony swimming and frolicking in the water, and according to some accounts, the frolicking got a bit out of hand. As the Queen bent over to inspect her new beavers, she turned to the HBC governor and explained, "Oh, whatever are they doing?" And showing some impressive diplomatic tact, he replied, "Ma'am, it's no use asking me. I'm a bachelor." Now, I'm not exactly sure what came of the beavers. Some accounts say that they ended up at the Assiniboine Zoo in Winnipeg, while others say they made it back to London, where they were held at the zoo where Winnie the Pooh once lived. But nonetheless, that was the very last time that the Hudson's Bay Company paid rent to the British Crown. And it's not because the royals stopped visiting. The Queen came back in 2010, and her grandson and future King William was here both in 2011 and 2016. However, it's got more to do with the fact that in 1972, the Hudson Bay Company moved its head office from London back to Canada, and several of the requirements in the charter, like the rent ceremony, were removed from the charter. So what do you think? I know my rent is a lot more than 2 beavers and 2 elks every single month, and I can only imagine how much rent should have been for literally half of the country. But I guess it's more of a symbolic thing and always has been. I can't even quite imagine the Queen hanging out with her royal rodents either. This whole situation was really interesting, but that's why we wanted to bring the story to you. That's what we do here at Canada Explained, is bring interesting Canadian stories. Like I said at the start, we do want to bring a series of 4-ish videos about the history of the HBC, the Northwest Company, and kind of how that all became Zellers. So if you did like this video, please help us out by subscribing, press the little bell so that you get a notification every time we leave a video, and we'll see you next time.